Hey guys, welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you so much for being here at our new show time, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. So besides the border crisis, the economy is at top of voters' minds. Usually it's all about the economy. Now we're told we have a shrinking middle class, record inflation, exploding national debt, and that we are in major trouble. But tonight's guest says things aren't as they seem. We're talking to economist and Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, Anthony Davies. Now, I found Anthony through the podcast that he co-hosts called the Words and Numbers podcast, and I also found him through the pandemic. He was really anti-lockdown. Recently, though, he did an episode where he says the middle class is shrinking and that it's a good thing. Now, I hadn't heard that one before, but it was a very interesting episode. So I wanted to share his perspective with you. So I invited him on to the show to share it. Now, before we get to this great conversation, first, let me tell you about this amazing giveaway. One country is giving away an all new Ozark cabin. One lucky winner and their crew will unpack a new life in this beautiful $1.5 million, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom cabin. Take advantage of ideal amenities for an Ozark getaway, including a stone fireplace accenting the open floor plan and spacious living areas, complete with 2 stories of covered balcony space overlooking thousands of acres of Ozark National Forest. It's absolutely beautiful. Gain access to an abundance of nationally known hiking trails, waterfalls, and some of the best views you'll find in America. The Ozark National Forest also features some of the best fishing and hunting grounds in North America. If you're not interested in the cabin, that's okay. The winner will have an option to take $1 million cash instead. So one country has given away $8.9 million and counting. Don't miss your chance to be the next winner. Become a One Country member and get automatically entered into all active giveaways every single month. Join the digital destination for country and Southern lifestyle fans. Go to onecountry.com/Kim and you're going to get 300 bonus entries just for signing up. So again, that's onecountry.com/Kim and get those 300 bonus entries. Definitely check out their site, check out their membership. I think it is really cool for Southern lifestyle, country and Southern lifestyle fans. I think it's really a great, cool thing. Plus you might win something really cool, like $1.5 million, Ozark cabin, pretty luxurious. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get to our conversation. Really excited to share this information with you and see what you think. Tell us if you agree or if you don't agree, but let's get to it. Anthony Davies, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get to the economy. That's what they always say, that it's the economy, stupid, is when it comes to how things are going to pan out, what people care about. I think just even around the world with different types of governments, we always say, oh, we want democracy to spread, or we want this, or, but people seem to care more about whether or not they can live a good life. More than anything, it is the number one thing in anybody's mind. Recently, I have to bring this part up. I want to get into this. Recently on your Words and Numbers podcast, you talked about the middle class. And one of the main talking points in politics is the shrinking middle class, bringing it up all the time. We got to do something about the shrinking middle class. But you say, yes, there's a shrinking middle class, but it's not a bad thing.
No, it's a really good thing.
It's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Kind of explain this to us.
What happens is when politicians talk about the shrinking middle class, the unspoken implication is the middle class is shrinking because we're migrating into poverty.
Yeah.
But if you look at the numbers, and Census Bureau makes these things available on a regular basis, so too the Congressional Budget Office. If you look at the numbers over time, what you find is that the middle class is shrinking. Adjusted for inflation, back in the 1970s, over 50% of us were in the middle class. Today, it's much less, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but I believe it's somewhere around 35 to 38%. So it's a dramatic shrinking of the middle class. But if you look at the poor classes, same thing. They're shrinking as well. And what's happening is we're moving into the rich classes, which today, and I'm going by census numbers, today they're counting it as anybody $100,000, any household $100,000 or up. And depending on where you live, $100,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, this is aggregate for the whole country.
Hmm.
So those rich classes are growing, and that's adjusted for inflation. So this is in real purchasing power terms. And I think people tend not to be aware of it because whenever something new or good comes along, it kind of very quickly becomes part of the normal. And
Hmm.
it's no longer this thing. There's a comedian who has this skit about he's on the plane, he gets Wi-Fi and how cool it is, and then it goes down, and now he's mad about it, and how quickly something goes from this is really neat, it's a new thing that I have, to this just should be here all the time. And we tend to
Hmm.
treat so many things like that. We lose sight of the fact that we've become incredibly rich. And so when I say things like the rich classes are growing, people kind of look at me strangely.
Do you think that, so I could understand that we're becoming wealthier. It seems like we're as a whole becoming wealthier. That's what you're seeing in the numbers, right? That the middle class is
Yes.
becoming wealthy, the poor class is becoming middle. But we're feeling extremely strapped for cash though. I mean, we're seeing well, I guess the first question I would have is what are they basing the numbers on? Like if they're saying, okay, you're not poor anymore, are they using the same, let's say, number since the 70s? And in the 70s,
Mhm.
it was if you made $25,000, you were middle class. And now and maybe that was middle class in 1970, but now today, they're still using the $25,000 mark, right? And they're saying, oh, you're
Right.
you're middle class. Like, is that what's
Yeah, no,
happening?
no. No, it's adjusted for inflation. So
Okay.
when I say, for example, any household from 100,000 up is considered in the rich classes, in 1970 the number wouldn't be 100,000, but whatever that number is, it's the equivalent to what today we call 100,000.
Okay.
So in terms
So it
of
is
real purchasing
adjusted for
power,
inflation because we've had
yeah,
quite a bit of
right.
inflation over the like especially recently.
Mhm. hmm Yeah, it's
Okay.
adjusted for inflation. And I think one of the things that happens, and you can see this in your own behavior, I don't mean you specifically, but people in general can see this in their own behavior. When you get a new job or you get a raise or something, your income goes up. What happens? Your spending goes up to match it. And at the end, you're as strapped for cash further down the road as you were earlier. What's happened is you've just expanded your spending. And so people will say things like, well, today's young people can't afford a house like their grandparents could. Well, the thing is, they could afford a house like their grandparents could. They don't want a house like their grandparents had. Houses
Hmm.
today are larger, they have central air conditioning, they have internet, Wi-Fi built in, all this stuff. You didn't have that in houses 2, 3 generations ago. And so we have this sense that if we can't if we can't have ever more year after year after year, somehow we become poor.
Hmm. Well, but I mean, if it is relative, because it would be in like, yes, we're a wealthier country. We don't really compare ourselves, for example, to Nicaragua, right? We don't say, well, I mean, obviously their middle class is much different than our middle class. Their middle class might look like our poor.
Well, yeah, and actually that's true not just for Nicaragua, it's true for the world. You take 7.25 an hour job in this country, which I don't think anybody's going to argue. That's a poverty wage, clearly,
Yeah.
7.25 an hour. 7.25 an hour, full time, you're earning gross around $15,000. Now, take into account differences in costs of living across countries. It's cheaper
Yeah.
to live in Mexico than it is to live in the US. And adjust that 15,000 for differences in costs of living. And what you find is that thing we call poverty in the US is actually middle class for the rest of the world.
Hmm. So I mean, I could see that we are certainly living larger than our grandparents. When I look at even where my grandparents lived, the home they bought after World War II, the home that they raised us all in, their kids and the grandkids, people buying, I mean, a house that size, I should say. I was about to say, well, people living in that neighborhood today, but that neighborhood is like a historic neighborhood now, so it's
Right,
really
right,
expensive.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but equivalent in size, if you take it out of the fact that it's now a historic $1 million neighborhood because people are crazy wanting to buy those old houses. Um, you put that in, right? That is a much smaller house than, I mean, that would be somebody that's considered poor living in a house that size today. You
Right.
know, a tiny
Yeah.
little house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 7 kids living in
Hmm.
that tiny little thing is
Yes.
not something that, today we would never even fathom that. We wouldn't fathom having 7 kids. But if we did, we wouldn't shove them in a 2 bedroom, 1 bathroom house with a basement and and saying, okay, well, a bunch of you are going to sleep in the basement,
Yeah,
right?
and
That
that
would be
was
poor,
usual. That was middle
right? That
class
was
a couple of
normal.
generations ago. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we want more. We're buying more, and that is, and so that's why you're saying that we're not actually as bad off as we say we are. We're just kind of doing a keeping up with the Joneses attitude.
Yeah, we are. And this is one of the strange things that if you've got something better, maybe it's a bigger house or it's a nicer car or it's a boat or whatever it is, you feel rich having that unless everybody has it. If everybody has it, all of a sudden you don't feel rich anymore. And I think that's where we are as Americans. Of course, there are exceptions, but largely speaking, we have become very rich, all of us.
Yeah,
And so we look around and we think, well, this isn't rich. I'm not rich. And the problem is we're surrounded by rich people. We complain in this country about the 1%. In a lot of ways, America is a nation populated almost entirely by one percenters when you think
yeah,
about 1% in the global sense.
right, right. The amount of wealth here compared to like
Right.
Nicaragua, other places.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you talk about housing. A good thing to talk about is medical care because we complain again in this country about the price of medical care. And it's absolutely right, the price of medical care is astounding. However, in a lot of ways, it's lower than what it was in the 1950s. And how do I know this? Because in the 1950s, people would routinely die of things that today you can walk into a pharmacy and get an over-the-counter cure for. You can go, you talk about 6, 7 figures to get a heart transplant. In 1950, that was science fiction. Infinite dollars wouldn't buy you a heart transplant. Today, you could get it merely for 6 figures.
yeah.
That's an astounding improvement.
So then what do you think the problem is? I mean, do you think that are we brainwashed? Are we living too high on the hog? Like, I mean, what
No,
is it?
I think in part it goes back to this idea that we're taught as children. Our grandparents and parents teach us this, and we tend to forget it, to be thankful for what you have. And I'm not saying that, you just be satisfied with everything, but you have something that's good, be thankful, look at it and say, this is a really cool thing I have here, rather than taking it for granted. And I think what's happened over time, we as a nation, we become richer in a slow sense, 3%, 4% a year, and you tend to not notice it. But you do
Mhm.
that 3 to 4% year after year, generation after generation, and all of a sudden you're in a situation where we're incredibly wealthy and we're unaware of it because it happens so slowly over time.
I think one of the problems was the boomer generation. And let me
How
explain.
come?
Well, because the generation, the World War II generation, what do they call them? What is
Right, the
the what is
boomers.
no
Or yeah,
the
no, the
before
greatest
then?
generation.
The
Yeah, the greatest
greatest
generation.
generation. Yeah,
Yeah.
the greatest generation. Wow, who named themselves that? So the greatest generation, they lived, when they bought a home, like my grandparents, for example, my
Mhm.
husband's grandparents, for example, they bought a home. It was almost their first home. Maybe it was their second home after being married and coming back from the war, but it was pretty early on, right at the very beginning of making their family, if they even had a kid at all. Okay,
Right.
for both grandparent sets, who are now 90, 95 years old, by the way. But um, they still live in that house. I mean, they owned that one house until the
Mhm.
day they died. They didn't upgrade. The boomer generation, though, had a different way of going about things. I mean, I was raised by a boomer. We switched houses. We upgraded houses. We started off in one home, and then I got to my teenage years and dad was doing better. So we moved into a bigger house, and then dad was doing better by the time I got, and then moved into a bigger house. And there was that upgrading that happened in that generation, whereas the greatest generation didn't do that. And so I
Right.
think then the subsequent generations, like mine and younger, in particular, well, probably like Generation X and some millennials that are raised by boomers, saw our parents upgrading constantly, able to get the bigger, you have a starter home. I don't know if that was a thing with the greatest generation, if they had
Mhm.
starter homes. They just had a house. Like I said, my grandparents had a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a basement, and they had that forever until the day they died. And they
Right,
bought that thing for like $8,000,
right,
back.
yeah.
And so maybe it was the boomers that kind of created this, buy more, buy bigger, upgrade your houses. And now the new generations, the younger generations now are not able to do that. They're not able to upgrade houses without moving into an entirely new city.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting there because you said earlier when you referred to your grandparents, having 7 kids in a 2-bedroom house. And so when the boomers came along, they were wealthier than the greatest generation, and so they could afford to upgrade. And so what did they do? They no longer had to have 7 kids in 2 bedrooms. Every
Yeah,
kid could have his own room, or maybe you have 2 kids sharing or something like that.
sure.
And then when the next generation, Generation X, comes along, they kind of start at that level, right? I mean, I've had a bunch of kids and we had them maybe two to a room, maybe one had one room, but we had six, so it was a lot, right? But the
Right.
thing
Yeah.
is, we start, each subsequent generation starts at that next level. And so I can look back at my parents and say, well, they went from house to house to house, getting bigger and bigger and bigger when I didn't. Yeah, except I started 2/3 the way along of where they were. In other words,
Hmm.
at age 25, I had a house that was equivalent to what my parents had at age 50.
But do you think it's because costs have gone up? So like so now generations are not able to upgrade. What I'm seeing now amongst my friends and slightly younger is that they buy a house and they realize unless they want to switch cities, they're going to have to live in that house like the greatest generation did forever. They're going to raise their family in that house. They're going to retire in that house. They're going to die in that house. Because right now, like for example, in Los Angeles, if you bought a house 10 years ago, I mean, now it's worth way more money. The inflation has gone so high that if you want to upgrade your home, you either have had to have a significant windfall of money suddenly, like more than just your average raise every year working a regular job. You'd have had to have a significant increase in order to stay even remotely in the same area and upgrade your home. Something that the boomers were able to do. They would just go down the street and get a bigger house. Now, you'd have to literally, pack up and move your kids, switch schools, switch your whole life, move far away. And so a lot of people are just not doing that anymore. Is that because of, I mean, what do you think why is there that inability anymore to be able to do that? Is that because of rapid inflation in the cities? Is it because our wages are not increasing at the same rate that boomers wages increased and they were able to do that? Is it that
Well,
they just lived in a different era and houses that the cost difference wasn't as high? Like, what do you think?
well, you used a word. You said, how is it that they can't do this? And I'm not sure that can't is the right word. Now, maybe in markets like specific markets like Los Angeles or Manhattan, can't is probably the exact right word. But in most of the country, I would say the right word isn't can't, but rather doesn't. That is, we choose to spend our money on other things. Yes, I'd like a larger house.
Hmm.
We say those words, but if you look at our behavior, what do? We put a large chunk of money into retirement, which earlier generations tended not to do. We buy a better car, a bigger car, multiple cars, which earlier generations tended not to do. We go on vacations, which earlier generations tended not to do. We spend our money in other ways. And so, in some sense, a lot of us, while we say we can't afford the larger house, what we really mean is we can't afford it given all of these things I'm already spending my money on, but we forget that our parents didn't spend their money on that stuff, in part
Yeah.
because that stuff didn't exist.
Right, but okay, so I can see where some of this for sure I understand, but I mean certainly we're not all crazy. I mean we do feel like things have just skyrocketed in price. I mean childcare has gotten enormously outrageous. Education, if you put your kid in a private school or if you going to college, I mean these things have gone. Are we just insane, or have
Yeah,
these
no, no,
things
no, not
actually?
not not insane at all. But I think what you're bumping up against is an observation bias, and that is we are very attuned to things that are expensive because things that are expensive are painful, and so they're top of mind, and we notice these things. things that become cheaper, we tend not to pay attention to. And so when we look around, we see all the expensive stuff, not seeing the other things that have become cheaper. Case in point is gas. Now, we complain about the price of gas, but if you calculate number of dollars it takes to buy enough gas to drive a mile, gas today is significantly cheaper than it was in the 1960s. But we tend not to notice this thing. Air travel, for example. Air travel, when I was a kid, was basically first class. That is,
Right.
if you couldn't afford a first class ticket, you couldn't afford to get in the plane at all, right?
Yeah.
And now you can, travel. I'm going to Phoenix tomorrow. I think the round trip ticket was like $300 or
Yeah.
something ridiculous, right? And so we tend to see the things that are more expensive, not see the things that are less expensive. That's not to say that the more expensive things aren't there. Yeah, of course, education costs more, healthcare costs more, but then there are these other things on the other side. So when you put it all together, our lives on the whole end up being a lot better than the lives of our parents and grandparents on average.
Now, I mean, you're making a good point because certainly when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, airline travel was, I mean, it was more attainable at that point, but it was still really expensive. And
Yeah,
most people
yeah,
didn't get on, they'd get on a plane once in a rare while. Most family vacations were done in the car, right? Everybody would
right.
pack up and drive
Yep,
to get where they needed to go. They'd across country even. I'd had cousins that lived in New York and they drive all the way to Idaho where I'm from. And it was just like 5
yep.
days to get there, but at least they made a family vacation out of it. I mean, you make a really good point. Back in the time of even when boomers were at college age, many of them were not going to college. So it wasn't, now we're saying, oh my gosh, college is extremely expensive. It's always been expensive. It's just that now more of us are going. So more of us are feeling the pain.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think more of us are feeling the pain, and I'm gonna go 180 degrees when you talk about college, because
Okay.
I do believe that college has become markedly more expensive over the past couple of decades. I just recently left academia. Had been teaching for 30 years in universities, and what I've seen is college become simultaneously more and more expensive, and I've seen the quality significantly deteriorate.
Hmm.
And I suspect that part of what's going on there is that we've somehow made getting a college degree this mark of excellence. It's a mark of excellence for the student who earns it, but it's also a mark of excellence for the high school teachers and the school districts that send the kids on to college. It's a mark of excellence for the universities who admit more and more students. And so it's as if the entire system is designed not with an incentive to educate students, but rather with an incentive to stuff more and more of them into the classroom. And when you do that, of course, the costs are going to go up.
So college is a different situation. That is the one thing that has gone up, and you think that it has been like it's definitely more expensive than it
Yeah,
was.
I would say it's not only more expensive, but on a dollar per unit quality basis,
Yeah.
it's gone through the roof. That you're
Has there
paying way more for way less.
Is there anything else? I mean, I know for you that's more you see that you saw that because you were
Yeah,
in the right. So that was
right.
something that you were really attuned to. But do you think that there was anything else that's similar to that? Like, I mean, you mentioned medical care has actually gone down in cost.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Now, medical care is interesting because medical care, I think, does the opposite. It goes up in cost just like higher education does, but it goes way up in quality, whereas
a dollar
college
for dollar.
education
Okay.
doesn't. Right. So, and I think there's a simple thought experiment here. When people complain about healthcare today, I say, okay, hang on. You can have healthcare at the prices that your grandparents had. All you have to do is refuse any medical treatment that didn't exist after 1950. Um, Refuse all those machines that go beep and refuse the drugs that you
Right.
get for it, right? And people say, oh, no, no, I don't want to do that. Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's my point. If you're willing to pay the high price for the better healthcare, then by definition, you're getting a better deal. Now, I'd like to pay less, mind you, but I certainly don't want to pay less and not get what I'm currently getting.
Yeah, this is interesting. I think that many of us have just been. I mean, why do you think we continue to say over and over that the middle class is shrinking and we're in dire straits?
We have a tendency to repeat things. someone will say something, whether it's a politician or somebody on the news or what have you, they'll say something that will strike a chord, and we'll just repeat it. And and what I have found is, I would say the things that you see on the news, roughly 40% of it is just simply wrong.
Hmm.
Things you hear from politicians, I'd say roughly 95% plus is simply
Yeah,
wrong.
right.
And yet we repeat this stuff, and then we hear people repeating the stuff that we repeated, and before you know it, everybody says, well, of course that's the way it is. I'll give you a good case in point. We keep repeating that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes. The Congressional Budget Office publishes every year the numbers. All you have to do is go and look at it. And there it is in black and white that Americans who are in the top 1%, the Congressional Budget Office will tell us all the federal taxes they pay. So income taxes, capital gains taxes, payroll, the whole thing, everything that they pay compared to their incomes. And you can do the math. And the top 1% are paying way more than anybody else is on a percentage basis. Now, we can
Hmm.
argue whether they should pay more or pay less than what they're currently paying. That's a good argument to have. But what you can't do is say somehow they aren't paying their fair share when they're paying, 30% versus the middle class that's paying 10 and the poor
Yeah.
are paying 2.
So these are just talking points that you think that we've just have been drilled into our head, but we don't actually have the data to back it up. One
Yeah,
thing though that I would
it's worse than that because the data are there. All you got to do is Google it, right? But we
right,
don't. We
right.
just hear it and we repeat it.
Right. One thing though that I do think has gone way up in price. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'll have the data on this one, but but food prices. So I can understand what you're saying about everything else. I do think that there is no doubt that my dad, my parents, myself, our generations are living better than the previous generations. When I compare it, just all of the thing, being
Right.
able to have multiple cars, that is something that older generations didn't have. They'd have one car for the whole family, not every single person getting a car and then all the teenagers getting cars, right? So, we definitely live in larger houses. We definitely are able to travel more. We have obviously things like the internet where we have access to everything. We have Netflix and YouTube, and we got
Mhm.
we've got all these things that they absolutely did not have. You're right. We have much better medical care. We're living longer. So I could see your point. You make a great argument on this. Food prices, though, I do think the food prices, like college, has gone way up and the quality has gone way down. They're just pumping us full of hormones and other crap.
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers to dispute that claim. I don't know one way or the other. I would be surprised, just at a gut level, I would be surprised to find that food prices have fallen, adjusted for inflation. I don't think
Right.
that's the case. Now, what I wonder is, as food prices go up, have they been keeping pace with the rise in our incomes? Are they going faster in incomes? I don't know the
Right.
answer to that. And I imagine it varies depending on whether you're talking about, bargain shopping at Aldi versus, Whole Foods, where things are
Yeah.
much more
Right.
expensive. Yeah, and are we talking about prepared stuff like from a fast food joint or something else? I don't know. But I take your point, that's something that I would certainly be, if I was interested in identifying things that have gone up in price adjusted for inflation, food is one of the things I'd look at.
Now, why explain the gas one again to me? How is it that we're going further with I mean, a gallon of gas is a gallon of gas, and it's gone way up in price.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing, right? Because when you buy a gallon of gas, you don't want the gallon of gas. What you want is that it causes your car to travel a certain distance, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so one of the things that's happened is that cars get far better gas mileage today than they did. So for a dollar's worth of gas, you can drive farther today than you could in the past. So that's one thing.
Okay.
Another thing is, although the price of gas has been going up, our incomes have been going up even faster. And so when you do all the math, it turns out that gas is pretty cheap. In fact, this is one of the reasons in this country we've had a problem with electric vehicles, the EVs, right? They just don't seem to catch on. And
Mm.
they don't seem to catch on, not in a broad way, in large part because gas is so cheap.
Yeah. Compared to Europe, for sure.
Oh,
The
yeah,
times I've
right.
lived in Europe, it's really expensive over there.
It is. Now, partly what's going on is a difference in taxes, that the taxes in Europe are so much higher that that's what
Mm.
drives the price of gas up. And we have the reverse problem in this country with wine. Go to Spain, go to France, and you get a nice bottle of wine for the equivalent of like $4. I'm
Yeah.
not kidding. Like like I look at this bottle of wine in Spain and I wonder how they can afford to sell me the glass bottle, let alone
Right.
the wine that's
Right.
inside, right? But
Yeah.
the difference is the taxes that we put on alcohol in this
Mhm.
country causes it to appear to be much more expensive than it actually is.
Well, if you've lived in Europe and grocery shopped, I've done that. I've lived in Europe and grocery shop there, and it is so much cheaper. Even just recently, I was living there in 2018, and it is so much cheaper. Going to the grocery store, loading up your cart with groceries, with really nice stuff, stuff
Yeah,
that here would be the expensive things like Gorgonzola cheese and salmon and, like all this really nice
right.
stuff. And that would cost a fortune. And over there, it's really inexpensive. So that's why I wonder if the food prices here have just gone way up. Some maybe because of big farming. I'm not really sure what the causes are of why Europe has such cheap food versus us, but it'd be
But
interesting to find out.
consider as well, and again, I take your point about the rising price of food, and I'm sympathetic to it. But then also notice other things. For example, last winter, this was the dead of winter, it's snowing, it's like 20 degrees outside, and I'm stopped at a gas station to get gas in the middle of Pennsylvania, and there on a rack are fresh bananas for 50 cents each. And I'm thinking to
Hmm.
myself, hang on a second. These are fresh bananas and they grow somewhere tropical. And here they are for 50 cents in the dead of winter. And that's another one of these things we tend not to think of. Once upon a time, actually, when I was a kid, fruit was seasonal. There were
Yeah.
certain fruits you get in some seasons, other ones you don't. Now you can get whatever you want, anytime you want.
Anytime. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's part of it's like the increased quality of healthcare. We've got an increased quality of our food stocks
Yeah.
in that sense.
Well, and that's all fine if your income is increasing, but we've got a lot of all those boomers are old now and they're on fixed incomes, retired. And so I think that is a major concern when everything is going up. Let's talk about that inflation. Are we inflating at a higher, like, how is the inflation going today versus how it did in the past, and what's causing that?
Yeah, inflation is higher now than it was, in the past several decades, and I predict it's going to remain high for the foreseeable future. And here's why: people point to the wrong things, and politicians are very happy when you point to the wrong things. They'll say things like, "Well, it's the rising cost of labor, or it's the increased demand for stuff, or whatever it is." Those things do indeed have an effect on prices in the short run. In the long run, inflation is caused by one thing and one thing only, and that is that your money supply grows faster than your production of goods and services, that you have more and more dollars chasing fewer and fewer goods and services. That
Hmm.
ultimately is the only thing that causes inflation. And what's happening, and the reason we're going to continue to have high inflation for the foreseeable future, is because the federal government is running, it's going to average $2 trillion deficits every year for the next decade. $2 trillion a year. So by the end of 10 years, we're currently at what, 33 trillion? By the end of 10 years, we're going to be hitting up against 60 trillion in debt. Where does the government get that money? Part of it comes from borrowing from us, right? So when your grandmother gives you a treasury bond for Christmas, that's actually she loaned money to the government. That's the treasury bond, right?
Yeah.
The problem is the government's running out of places to borrow. The private markets are they continue to loan more and more money to the government, but not at the rate the government needs it. So who fills in the gap? It's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve loans money to the government, but here's the problem. When the Federal Reserve loans money to the government, that's new money coming into the system. It expands the money supply, and that is the source of the inflation. The reason we're going to have heightened inflation for the foreseeable future is because the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to finance the federal deficits.
What does that mean for us?
Well, what it means is we have to do one of two things. Either we get used to a new normal, and the new normal is instead of baseline inflation being 2%, baseline inflation is going to be 3, possibly 4%. That's one thing that we do, get used to the new normal. The other thing we can do is demand that our politicians get serious about balancing the budget, right? And they tend not to They tend to not want to be serious, and really we complain about it, but we don't want them to be serious, because when any one of us says to our elected representatives, look, I want you to balance the budget, and the representative says, okay, I can cut this, 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 and this, and we say, hang on, that last thing, whether it's mortgage deduction or student loan repayment or whatever it is, that last thing, don't cut that, but cut those
Yeah.
other things. And there's 300 million of us. Each one of us has a different list. And when
Yeah.
you're all done, nothing gets cut.
Right. So then so then what's going to happen?
What's going to happen, I believe, is we just get used to the new normal. Inflation on a regular basis is going to be 3 to 4%. And that's
Can it
just the
go
way
on
life
forever
is.
like that? I mean, it can't.
Well,
Seems like
it
it
can
can't.
do. It can do. Here's where life becomes a problem. Life becomes a problem when the politicians get used to the new normal. And when they get used to the new normal, all of a sudden, no longer is it $2 trillion a year deficits, it's $4 trillion a year deficits.
Right.
And when they start that, then we're back to, well, the new normal is not 4% inflation, it's 6% inflation.
Yeah. I feel like
Now
we're
you got
already
a
doing
problem.
that. I feel like that's what's happening now.
We have been for several decades in this country without statesmen. And I use the term broadly. And I don't care whether it's Democrat or Republican or something else. We haven't had anyone in the political arena who's willing to kick politics in the teeth and say, this is what we need because this is what is good for the country.
Yeah. Do you think that we're in dire strait? I mean, do you think with the way that it's been right now with this increasing inflation, the spending, the national debt is massive, and it seems to have become much greater very recently since
Mhm.
COVID, right? I mean, is that when it just
Oh,
really
yeah.
skyrocketed?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did with COVID, yeah.
I mean, do
And
you think that there's going to be any sort of negative repercussions on? I mean, if we just get used to the inflation, so we get used to it. I mean, is there any other negativity to this besides
well,
like, oh, they might like it and they might want to do it again? I mean, that's a fair enough,
yeah.
concern. But let's say they don't, and then are we
And
okay?
yeah, and this is the thing that politicians will say. They'll say, well, COVID was just a one-off thing.
Yeah,
And
right.
yeah, and well, but the thing is, you can go back and pretty much every 10 years, a one-off thing happens, right? In 2020, it's COVID. In 2010, plus or minus, it was the housing meltdown. In 2000, it was 9/11. In 1990, it was, I forget what 1990 is, but there was something there. Every 10 years, one of these things comes along that causes politicians to say, okay, let's ratchet up government. They
Hmm.
ratchet up, but they never ratchet it back. Now, you can keep doing that, and we've gotten to the point now where we're going to have to pay for it through inflation. Every time we get a push on the ratchet, henceforth, we're going to get another bump in inflation. It's going to stay there. But eventually, you reach a point where the money just loses its value too quickly. And if you want an example of this, look at Argentina. In Argentina, they got to the point, and they did this. It was the printing of the money and the massive inflation. They got to the point in Argentina where people no longer counted money. They weighed it because the individual bills were so worthless. You want to buy a dozen eggs, 2 pounds of currency. So you dump it on the scale. That 2 pounds of
Yeah.
currency, that's probably right, right? And so that's where you end up if you keep going the way we're going. How long would it take us to get to that point? The United States has a tremendously vibrant, productive economy. So I think it would take a tremendous amount to get us to Argentina. The problem is I don't see any force pushing back. I only see political forces pushing forward. Give it another 100 years and we'll look very much like Argentina at this rate.
So we could say theoretically, like, okay, we're spending as much as we're going to spend ever, and we're just going to stop the spending. We're not going to have new programs, new this, new that. We're not going to cut anything, but we're also not going to add anything. We could theoretically do that, and you think we'd be okay?
Yeah, in fact, you can, and I've run the numbers on this, you can get back to a balanced budget by doing the following. Cut the federal budget 10% this year, and then hold it constant. Don't increase it, not for inflation, not for anything. Hold it constant for 6 years. So 10% cut this year, hold constant for
Hmm.
6 years, and thereafter, You'll then get a balanced budget at that point. And thereafter, you can increase government spending if you want, just don't increase it faster than the economy grows. And you will
Hmm.
have continual balanced budgets thereafter.
10% only for 6 years?
10% and then, no, 10% once and then hold it constant. No more increases, no more cuts, but no more
Right, right,
increases for
right.
6 years.
But just
Yeah.
do
And that
a
gets us,
one-time cut of 10%,
yeah.
and then for 6 years do that, and then you can then you can add for inflation, but only for inflation. So you're not really adding anything at
Oh,
that
no,
point.
you could add more than inflation, just don't add more than the growth of the economy.
Oh,
So if
right.
the
Okay.
economy, yeah,
Okay.
right. And so what happens at the end, if you look at the numbers, this has been the case for some time now. Our government is consistently about 6 years ahead of the economy. In other words, the government we have today, we won't be able to afford until 2020, or until 2030, 6 years from
Right.
now. The
Huh.
government we had 6 years ago, today we can afford that government. We're
Okay.
constantly
What would
6 years
be
behind.
Yeah, so that sounds like, wow, that's so easy. 10% and then just hold for 6 years. We could do that. We could do that. That's like nothing.
Right.
But what is 10%? And
Well,
what would we be cutting, do you
yeah,
think?
see, and that's the question. That's where the whole thing becomes a problem because I can immediately identify 10% that should be cut, and you can immediately identify 10% that should be cut, but they're not going to be the same 10%. And so now it's a
Right.
question of, well, what are we going to cut, right?
Yeah.
It
What would you
becomes,
suggest?
it's not an economic problem, it's a political problem. I
Yeah,
can,
right.
I can tell you something that we can cut, and it is the single biggest line item on the budget, and that's Social Security.
Oh
And well,
boy.
yeah, I know this is a thing people say. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to propose cutting Social Security, but I'm going to propose doing it in a way that harms no one.
How?
Here's how you do it. You make use of the fact that the return on Social Security is abysmal. If you take all the money that you pay to Social Security and that your employer pays on your behalf, take all of that and add it up and do the math, and then look at the retirement benefits you'll get when you retire and calculate what is the effective rate of return. If that were an investment that you put your money into and you got money back when you retire, what's the rate of return you're getting? And the answer is about 2%.
Okay.
It's ridiculous. In the
Right.
stock market, if you get 7% in the stock market, you aren't doing it right. So,
Right.
so here's the thing. Here's what we can do. We say to people today who are 45 and younger, we say to them, you all continue to pay into Social Security. And when you reach age 45, from that point forward, you no longer pay. So that
Okay.
12% that was going to Social Security, you keep the whole thing, you put it into a private retirement account, you do whatever you want. In exchange, when you hit retirement, you don't get any benefits. No retirement benefits. Now, it turns out Social Security is such a bad investment that the average American is better off paying into it up to age 45 and then walking away and saying, fine, I give up all of my benefits, just don't tax me for Social Security anymore. The average American's better off doing that. If you do that, you get to do two things. One is you create a wave of Americans who are no longer on Social Security. So when the
Hmm.
person born today reaches age 65, there'll be nobody left on Social Security. That's the
Yeah.
first thing you do. The second thing you do is you continue to fund it for the people who are currently retired.
Yeah.
So those of you who are less than 45, you're still paying in. Where does that money go? It goes to the current retirees. So it's win-win all the way around. And when you're done, here's a massive program that's generating hundreds of billions of dollars in deficit for the federal government. No longer does that. The federal government itself will be better off to the tune of about $400 billion a year. It's win-win-win all the way around. Here's the problem. It took us 100 years to dig this hole that is Social Security.
Yeah.
To come out is going to take about another 100. And we can't get politicians to agree on what they're going to do next January, let alone agree to hold to this plan for 100 years.
The other problem is we can't rely on people to make good decisions with their money. I mean, we just can't. It is not in my best interest or your best interest to assume that our neighbors are doing what they should be doing with their money, and then they end up old and on the street. And that is something that's bad for you and me than living in a community where all of a sudden there's a bunch of old homeless people, and then that's inhumane and we think, well, we can't leave them out. I mean, it's like, so what do we do about that?
Right.
I mean, Social
Yeah.
Security is at
And
least the safety net for the people that aren't good with money.
yeah, see, and there are two answers to that. The first answer is you actually keep Social Security, but you keep it in its original intended form, which is a safety net for the poorest of the poor. Social
Okay.
Security was never supposed to be general retirement for
For
everybody.
everybody, right? Okay.
Right. So we keep it for the people like you're describing. So that's item number one. Item number two, be careful because I share your concern. There are going to be people who don't invest their money well and they end up on the streets when they're retired. But at the same time, if we are free and equal people, one of the implications is that we should be free to make bad decisions. Because
Right.
ultimately, that's what freedom is, right? If we're all making
Sure.
good decisions, we're all making the same decisions, right? And so for me to say, I have the right to tell you what you're going to do with your money because if I don't, you'll spend it poorly. Why stop at Social Security? Why not go to what you buy for your groceries? You're buying fast food. This is bad for you. What type of car you buy, where you live, what job you take. And see, all of a sudden now, with that well-intentioned, and I feel it, that well-intentioned thing of, well, we need to tell people what to do, all of a sudden we're no longer free and equal people.
I think, well, where I would draw the line is just where it starts to impact me. I mean, because I think that even though I
Right.
do care about people and I care about their well-being, I think that what resonates and what we could actually sell is what impacts you and what I think is fair is what impacts me. I mean, I live in LA. We got a lot of homeless people. I don't want to, I don't want to get rid of homelessness because I feel bad for the homeless people. I mean, I do feel bad for them, but I want to get rid of homelessness for me. It's a very selfish reason.
Right.
I just don't want to step over homeless, people that are drugged out on the street. I don't want needles on the street. I don't want the feces on the street, right? I have selfish reasons for wanting to end homelessness. So it's not
Yeah. And
about their life choice. They made bad life choices. I get it,
mhm,
whatever, but it's about me and the choice. I didn't make those
sure.
bad life choices, but why do I have to then live in literal human feces because they
Right.
made bad choices and I didn't, right? So it's about building a society that I want to live in, and that includes not having sick people, not having homeless people, not having old people sitting on the steps of some church asking for money, every time I walk by. I mean, that would be heartbreaking.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. And but I think there's a right way and a wrong way to go about doing what you're suggesting. The wrong way is that we go to Washington and we say, here's a problem, fix it. Because Washington's going to impose one solution that fits nobody. It's going to be too much for some areas and not enough for another. I think the way to handle these things is through I'm going to use a term here. Our brothers and sisters on the left use the term subsidiarity. Our brothers and sisters on the right use the term federalism, but they're both talking about the same thing, which is governing at the lowest possible level. If there's a problem of homelessness in Los Angeles, Los Angeles' city government should be handling that. And it should rise to the level of California only if Los Angeles is incapable of handling it. And it should rise
Mhm.
to the level of Washington only if California is incapable of handling it. But
Yeah.
ultimately, I think if we govern that way at the lowest possible level, we'd be able to solve the problems like you're describing with minimal unintended consequences because the law, the rules that work for Los Angeles are wreaking havoc in Denver, right? You won't have that.
Well, but then the only other problem with that is that if let's say you live in a community that refuses to handle homelessness at all, and then a neighboring community handles it, but the way they handle it is, let's say, give every person a tiny home, just a basic thing, then all the homeless people suddenly start flooding into that city and going into those,
Right,
wanting a tiny home because they're not
right.
getting anything in Los Angeles. So it almost has to be a collective. It's kind of like gun, with the people that want, I'm a 2A person myself, but the people that want gun control, like here in California, we have really strict gun control, but it's like, we have open borders. I mean,
Right.
people can buy guns anywhere and bring them in. So why are you stopping Californians from owning them when they're just going to go get them in Nevada, right? And then drive them, or Idaho, and drive them in where I'm from. So, that's it's kind of like COVID. They tried to lock down, shut down, thinking that the virus wouldn't get in. And it's like, come on,
Mhm.
it's a virus. Of course it's going to spread. We're one big
Yeah,
community. So
yeah, and
how do you then count for that?
I think you're right. I think one of the things we have to come to terms with is that economic systems, political systems are gatherings of human beings, and human beings are imperfect. We're never going to get the right answer to everything. We're never going to do things perfectly. I think what we need to do is try and do things as best we can. And
Yeah.
subsidiarity or federalism doesn't answer every problem, but it answers a lot of them well, as opposed to the way we do things now, which is upside down, having Washington handle it. So my advice would be start with subsidiarity, start with federalism, and if we have the problem you're describing, which actually you do have in California,
Yeah.
raise it up a notch. Let's talk about the county level. Let's talk about the state level. And when we've exhausted everything at those, and it's obvious, look, we've got people coming in from Nevada to take advantage of the small homes, then you elevate it to Washington.
Yeah. I mean, I don't live in this area anymore in Los Angeles, but I used to live in Venice Beach and I lived there for about 10 years. And Venice Beach is, it's really gotten really bad there, the homelessness issue. But I lived right on the border of Venice Beach and Santa Monica has somehow like they don't, well, I know how they did it, but they made it to where you can't be home. You can't like loiter around in Santa Monica near the beaches. So what they would do is they would literally round them up. They would pick them up and drop them off in Venice. They would just
Wow.
drive a
Yeah.
half a mile and be like, this is where you could go. You can't be here because they have their own government, their own police departments, their own laws. And yet you can't tell where Venice Beach begins and Santa Monica ends. It's all one right there.
Yeah.
It's not a big place. And so they would literally just kind of round them up and move them over and made it our problem rather than them helping out at all. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's so I think especially when we're dealing with a large community, I mean, unless we're going to close all borders, right? Unless we're going to say, okay, states' borders are closed, and you have to actually apply to become a Californian, or you have to apply to become a Floridian, or which I'm sure in
Mhm.
Florida, many of the native Floridians wish that they had that at this point with all the flood of people going in,
Yeah.
right? But that's interesting. I mean, I do agree that on a community level, I think communities can know what the problems are better than the federal government, for sure. But it's just a matter of, you know, I don't, some of the communities are not going to handle it. And then it's going to become somebody else's community's problem. And then we can't control the other community.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about Santa Monica when you're living in Venice?
And I don't know the answer to that. And one of the things we have to come to terms with is sometimes the answer has nothing to do with politics or economics. It it has to do with goes to the nature of the human being.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to I don't, it's not my expertise. I don't know what to do. All I can tell you is that politics and economics can only answer some questions. They can't answer all of them.
Right, right. Before we wrap this conversation up, I want to look at kind of the larger picture of what's going on in the world. And I don't know if you've focused much on the world economics of, where we are on the world stage as the country, but a lot of people are really concerned and worried about where the US is heading financially, with many of the nations around the world looking like they're edging away from the dollar for sure. I mean, they're going towards BRICS. They're weary of the U.S. and the U.S. dollar because of the sanction. There's a lot of they don't want to rely on it when they can't get their money. If we get mad, or if we're at war, or they get sanctioned, or where do you think we're headed? Where do you think that there'll be a massive impact with the maybe going from a hegemony to like a multipolar world?
Yeah. I think it's your concern about BRICS isn't. I don't share that concern, at least not at this point. And here's why. BRICS is their attempt. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China attempting to form their own currency to be a
Yeah,
rival to the US dollar. And part of the problem there is the economies in those countries are not nearly as strong as the US economy. And ultimately, what gives any piece of currency value is the stuff that country produces. The reason dollars have value is because Americans produce stuff. We're really
yeah,
good at doing that. Also, I would add, Who's the major player in the BRICS currency? It's China.
Yeah.
To tie yourself to a currency that is largely influenced by a non-market based economy is extremely dangerous. It's like getting into a car that has no brakes and say, let's go for a joyride, right?
Yeah.
Now, when does it become a problem? It becomes a problem when the scenario I just outlined of the new normal becomes 4%, then it becomes 6, then it becomes 8. Now all of a sudden, BRICS currency or something like it starts to look more attractive.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think we've gone a long way by having the dollar as the reserve currency. It's the currency that people of the world went to invest in, to hold. But the reason they did that is because its value was stable and we produced a lot of stuff that you could buy
Right.
with it.
But we don't
If you,
really produce stuff anymore, do we? I mean, China and Vietnam and all these other countries are producing stuff.
oh, we do. We produce a tremendous amount of stuff. Our major export is machine parts. And we don't realize that because when people say, particularly politicians, they say the decline of American manufacturing, and you look at the graph and they show you Americans employed in manufacturing, and it goes down, 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 which is absolutely right. What they don't show you is output of manufacturing. It goes up, up, up. What's happening is the reason fewer Americans are being employed in manufacturing is because we are so incredibly good at it. We don't need to employ many. We can produce twice as much as we used to using 1/3 the labor. We're really
Right.
good at producing stuff.
Well, I mean, so that's right. It sounds like we're good at producing stuff, but just without without people. So we've just left people with no job. Like, oh, we don't need you
Well,
anymore. We replaced you with a robot.
no, but yeah, but see, it's different because what's happened is it's not that we're producing it without people. We're producing it without human labor. Where's our
Yeah.
human labor going? It's gone from our muscles of moving stuff to our brains, where we sit and we do things on computer.
Yeah.
So there are more Americans employed today, twice as many Americans employed today as there were in 1950.
Hmm.
And what are we doing? We're doing brain stuff instead of muscle stuff.
So when it comes, I mean, look, I maybe BRICS is not a concern right now. Maybe it won't be for a while, but at some point, I mean, right, we can't assume that the U.S. dollar's really going to be the forever, or like the Roman Empire falls, all the
Right.
empires fall. At when that happens, what would happen to us? I mean, are we in a bad, like maybe that's, some people might think that's 5 years away. Some people might think that's 500 years away.
Right.
Either
Yeah.
way.
And I think what happens to us is the following. Um, it becomes it becomes harder to inflate our currency. So what's been going on, we've been printing this money to fund the federal government that's spending money it doesn't have, and that's
Hmm.
giving us this inflation. We haven't felt the full effect of that inflation because the inflation is spread over everyone who holds the dollar. So we only feel, let's say, 60% of the inflation. The other 40%, the foreigners feel who are holding the
Hmm.
US dollars. If all of a sudden the US dollar is no longer a reserve currency, the foreigners aren't holding it. So
Hmm.
as we inflate it, we now feel 100% of the pain,
Right.
100% of the inflation. So that becomes one of the major problems.
So then we become like Venezuela.
Well, I'm not going to say we become like Venezuela at that point, but if you keep going down that path, yeah, you do. You become like
Okay.
Venezuela.
Mm.
I said Argentina earlier. Did I mean Venezuela? Sorry about
Oh,
that.
maybe you said, yeah, I think you meant, did you mean Venezuela, or did you say, or did you mean
I think
Argentina?
I meant Venezuela. I have Argentina on the
Okay.
brain. I
Okay.
was doing some Argentina research
Although there
earlier.
was a time when Argentina had a moment,
There
didn't
was,
they?
yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah,
well, overall, it sounds like you have a really positive. I mean, am I reading this wrong? Do you have a positive outlook on our economy at this point?
I do. I do.
Okay.
Americans, Americans do, of all the things we do, I think there's one thing we do better than anybody else on the planet, and I don't think it has anything to do with us as a people. It has to do with our system. We encourage entrepreneurship. Our heroes are entrepreneurs, and when you live in a society that encourages entrepreneurship, you've got people constantly looking for better ways to do things and new products. And so long as that continues, this economic juggernaut will just keep running. The problem comes when we turn to the entrepreneurs and we say, there's something wrong with you. You've taken from the economy. You need to give back. You're not paying your fair share. that becomes a bit dangerous. Don't vilify the people who are driving the economy.
Yeah. I agree with you there. I mean, I live in the state of California. Technically, I have my own business doing this independent program, and it is hard in a left. I mean, in a liberal state,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't know where you are politically actually at all, Anthony. But I'm somebody that came from the left. I was a big Bernie person. I grew up in the conservative state of Idaho, so I was always like the lone. My family was Democrats in the state of Idaho, which is all. But I've
The
always kind
one.
of yeah, right. But I've always been more on the left, but have certainly moved now more independent in the center. And um, I don't even know where I was going with that. I have no idea why I started down that path, to be honest, telling you why I've come from the left. I'm now in the center. This is all very interesting, this conversation. I have no idea where I was going with that. I lost my train of thought. Whatever. It
Well,
doesn't.
let me help you out a little bit, because I'll say one thing about the left and the right in this country. If there's one thing that worries me most about our future, it's not the economy, and it's not really our politics. It's us, that we have divided. That if you identify as someone on the left, then everyone on the right is stupid. If you identify
Yeah.
as somebody on the right, everyone on the left is evil, or whatever it is. And I submit that we need both. We need the left and the right, because the left, being the liberal, is looking for new stuff to jettison the stuff we've done poorly and bring on new things. The right, the conservative, is looking to preserve the stuff that we've done. And both sides are right. We do need to move forward. We need to look at new things. But in the process of doing so, we've got to be very careful that we don't jettison things that have become very important to us. A good case in point is the family.
Mm.
The nuclear family of a husband and a wife, and they don't have to, they can both be working. I don't care about that. But a stable family is important, and it's something that's associated with the conservatives. And the liberals say, well, we're all for free love and all this stuff. Yeah, there's a
Right.
reason. There's a reason that model has persisted for millennia through human history. And maybe we're not quite sure what that reason is, but be very cautious abandoning
Yeah.
it. And that's something that conservatives bring to the table. They warn us, don't get rid of these things, they're good.
Yeah, that we've had good things for a while. We don't need to change it just to change it. And you're right. I think that
Right, yeah, yeah.
liberals have a mindset of wanting change, wanting to explore, wanting to try new things. And conservatives say, I like things the way they are. I want to stay the way. And so let's, no, I don't want to change. And that kind of push pull allows us to have those explorations while
Right,
keeping good things. So you're
right.
right. I do think we absolutely need both. I remembered my train of thought now. I
Yeah,
was talking about business, having business in California as a liberal, in a liberal state that has put in liberal values into the politics has made it very difficult for entrepreneurship in this state. And that's why so many have now flooded on to Texas, to Florida. Many have
yeah,
gone to my home state of Idaho because they're looking for, they're looking for those states that embrace entrepreneurship, that embrace small businesses. And in a state like California, they really are killing the small businesses and they're killing that entrepreneurship. And I think you're right that is the backbone of American society. Our entrepreneurship, our small businesses have gone way down, especially the small businesses. Entrepreneurship, I get, maybe you could fudge those numbers a bit by saying like the gig economy. Everybody's kind of got a gig going on. So everybody's kind of an entrepreneur. But the small businesses have really taken a hit decade after decade after decade. And we've seen larger corporations and smaller mom and pop shops. And it would be great to
yeah.
get back to more of those mom and pop shops and really have the government, whether it be federal or state, and I think I think states like Texas and Florida are gonna push California towards that because California's losing people and they see that businesses want to go somewhere else. So they're gonna have to make change in the policies. So
Right.
we might embrace more of that culture of um, getting those small businesses back and having that entrepreneurship. I think you're right. That is the backbone of American society. That is the beauty of it. That's why people flood here. They
Yes,
want to
yes,
start businesses.
yes. I
I,
mean, people say they come here because they want a better life.
yeah.
That's how you get a better life. You become an entrepreneur. You create more for yourself, for your family, for others.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something that's so absolutely important. Um, I really appreciate this conversation. I like, again, I don't know where you land politically, and that's fine. I think that it's great to get your perspective. You've made a lot of sense. There's a lot of things I didn't think about. I I've been brainwashed to believe that we have a shrinking middle class, but you're convincing me that maybe
We do, but it's okay. It's a really good thing.
right. Well, and I do when I compare myself to my grandparents, I absolutely have way more. I mean, that's just
Mhm.
we all do. We all have way more than our grandparents. Like pretty.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's the one-off, but I
Yeah.
think we all do. So we're living in a different. It's interesting, very interesting. Um, where can people? So you have this great podcast. What I like about it is the episodes seem shorter. They're easily digestible. I think everybody should listen to the middle class one. I'm going to put that link down below so they can listen to the whole, because you
Thank
have
you.
a whole graph with numbers and you really give
Yes.
those numbers in that episode. So I want people to listen to that. And it's very easy. It's a 30-minute episode. Listen to it. How often do you do that podcast?
We come out once a week. We've been doing so since 2017, so we have 370 episodes uh, under
And
our
are they
belts.
all about 30 minutes or are they ranging?
Everyone, yeah, give or take. Some go over,
Yeah.
some go under, but yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we also have, I'll plug as well, a book, Cooperation and Coercion, which you can find on Amazon. There's an Audible version, and we talk about many of the things that we talk about in the podcast. Basically, what does it take to form a civil society in terms of economics and politics?
All right. Well, those links are down below. Thank you so much for being here. Really
Thank
appreciate
you,
your
Kim.
time.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that is it for today's show. Thank you so much for joining. Tell me what you think. I would love to get your thoughts on everything that Anthony said. I thought that he had some really great points, but I always love hearing from you. Email me, Kim@KimIverson.com, and share with me your thoughts on today's conversation.